Hello everyone, it's Nina. Thanks so much for joining me today. Today I have a couple of ideas to share with you featuring the Tim Holtz Distress Crayons, which are a product that are fairly new to the Distress line from Tim Holtz. I'm going to be sharing with you a way to do some watercoloring with these Distress crayons to create some really fun, fantastic results. I'm going to be creating not only a card with you today, but I'll also be sharing how I created this really cute canvas using the Distress crayons and the Tim Holtz Crazy Dog stamp set, which is also a new product from Tim Holtz. I'll also be sharing a couple of other techniques along the way, so let's get started and check out the video. Here I've got the Distress crayons. This is one of the packs here. You can see you get 6 Distress crayons in each pack. There's one of the packs is more neutral colors like picket fence, black soot, and then there's some other ones that have really bright colors like festive berries and peacock feathers, twisted citron. You can see these Distress crayons are built kind of like a gelato. They also look a little bit more like a lipstick tube. You can see that you can turn the bottom portion of the crayon to get the crayon to move up and down within its barrel. I'm also going to be using these little mini canvases. I'm going to be linking down in the video description and also on the Simon Says Stamp blog to something that's very similar. These I found at my local craft store. These are just little canvases that are mounted onto some chipboard. And you could also do this onto a regular canvas that's wood mounted, but I wanted to have something more sturdy, so this is why I'm going to use these. And then here's a look at the Crazy Dog stamp set. This is a new stamp set from Tim Holtz that I absolutely love, these fun little images, and they go perfect with the crazy cats and the crazy things, a couple of other stamp sets that Tim has done in the past. Okay, so now let's look at one of the other products that we're going to be using for today. In particular, we're going to need this for our canvas. The canvas that I'm using and the ones that I'll also be linking to below have a coating that are on them, and that's not going to work as well for our coloring because the crayon is going to be able to smear on that coating. The coating is a little slick. So what you want to do is you want to apply some gesso. This is some Dina Wakley gesso, and I'm just applying a thin coat across this canvas, making sure I get all the areas covered. I'm going back over top of the different areas of the canvas just to make sure I get it completely covered. And I'm using a sponge brush to apply it. You could use a palette knife or a paintbrush, whatever you have that works best for you. But I'm going over top and allowing that gesso to really cover this canvas really well. And that gesso is also collecting onto my sponge, the extra that I'm not using, so I'll be able to wipe that off when I'm done. Now I'm going to go ahead and stamp my dog for the card while I wait for the gesso to dry on the canvas. So this dog is a really cute one, and I love how adorable his face is. Now you can see I messed up as I was getting ready to stamp this. I wasn't sure how I wanted to stamp it, and then I was like, oh, I touched the paper. Now, I'm not too worried about this because I'm thinking, oh no, now what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and stamp it down. And I'm not too worried about it because the drawings of these particular stamps have a little bit more of a sketchy, distressed look. But I'm also going to be coloring over top of it. So I'm really not too concerned about the fact that it has that little bit of a smudge on there. So I'm going to start by applying my crayon down onto the darkest areas where I want the coloring to be. And I'm going to start blending this out with a Tim Holtz detailer brush. This is a water brush. And I'm just applying the water over top of the distressed crayons just to get them moving a little bit and really blending into the paper. Now the first coat's going to stain a little bit more than the next coats will. The next coats are going to sit on top of the distressed crayon that we've already applied down. So you can see here that I'm having a little bit of texture from the crayon that I applied down because it's stained a little bit to the paper. And I actually want that because I want the texture of the crayon to show through. And I really like how it adds the look of fur to this dog. So I'm not going to try to really worry about blending that out because it's really not going to blend any more than it has. And you can see as I'm applying this down, I'm putting it in the darkest areas, and that's going to help me get a little bit more of a realistic shading. These are hard to get into really tiny areas because of course the points of them are so large. However, I'm going to show you here, I wanted to add some mixture of color together to create a new color. And I just scribbled it onto some watercolor paper, and I'm picking it up with my water brush, and that's going to help me have a little bit more of a softer look and also allow me to blend a more custom color for the areas that I want to have colored. Now for this particular image, I'm going to actually be doing a couple of layers on each area, and you'll see as I go along how I end up adding the additional layers on top of my image. I'm going to go ahead and keep working on his collar. I'm just using some orange to go ahead and apply a little bit of shading to that. And again, I'm just blending that color out with my water brush to help it have a more watercolored appearance. Here I'm bringing in some antique linen over top of that darker brown that I applied down for the dog's body. And this is going to just give him a little bit different color tone. I didn't want quite as dark of a brown as I had originally, and I wanted him to have a little bit more extra color. So I'm going to go ahead and blend that in. And then after I've applied that down, I'm going to go ahead and bring in some more of that brown. I'm picking it up off of a piece of watercolor paper because I want to be able to control where I'm putting it. And I'm just adding this in the darkest areas just to really darken those deepest areas of his body up and really have some contrast showing on this image. I'm going to set this aside to let it dry. And now I'm going to take another image from the Crazy Dog stamp set and stamp this down onto my canvas. Now I'm stamping this in some Simon Says Stamp Intense Black dye ink. You could go ahead and stamp it in a more permanent ink. However, this ink I will go ahead and heat set with my heat gun just to make sure it's nice and dry. You can see it's a little light, and that's okay. I'm going to go back over top of it after I've done the coloring to go ahead and intensify the darkness of those lines. But if that bothers you, you might want to go ahead and stamp it a second time, maybe with a Misty stamping tool, or go ahead and use a more permanent ink like StazOn ink would be a good one to use. So go ahead and play around with the different types of inks that you have to get the look that you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and start coloring after I dried the image. I'm using some antique linen to do the same exact thing that I did for the first image. I'm applying it to the darkest areas and then blending that out with my water brush. And I'm just allowing the crayon to go ahead and blend into the lighter areas of the image. Now, this canvas has a little bit more tooth to it than the watercolor paper did. You're going to see the texture of the canvas a lot more than you saw the texture of the paper underneath the images that we colored on the watercolor paper. And I actually really like how this looks. It really allows the texture of the crayon to really show through. And I love how the gesso allows the color to really move along the paper really well. If you have any trouble with your distress crayons, maybe try going ahead and applying gesso to your paper. That might help you get a more better blend as well. I didn't try that yet, but that is something I'm planning on doing with my distress crayons, is going ahead and applying a layer of gesso onto my watercolor paper before I go ahead and actually do some coloring on top. But I did like the results that I got with the distress crayons onto the watercolor paper without adding the gesso. But again, it's totally your preference to go ahead and try out the different things that you might find work best for you. I'm going to add some darker shading using the same technique that I did for the dog. I'm just applying it down onto a piece of watercolor paper and picking it up with my brush and then blending that out. And once these distress crayons dry, we've reacted them with water, but once they dry, they don't react anymore. So you'll see as I apply these colors down, the new layers of the distress crayon, then the bottom layer isn't reacting because it's already dried and it's pretty much permanent in that sense, in that it doesn't actually do any sort of fancy technique that the first layer did. So this is a really great way to be able to add layers of color on top of something without having to worry about messing up the layers that you already applied down before. Now for the background, I wanted to have the background of this canvas have a nice dark, bold red color. So I'm taking the distress crayon and applying it along the edges of the canvas, and then I'll go ahead and blend that out towards the center with my water brush. And I really love how you can create such quick backgrounds with these distress crayons and just a water brush. Another thing you can do with these distress crayons is actually smudge them. And I'll show you in a minute after I've colored in this canvas and stamped my sentiment. I'm going to be able to create some pattern and some texture to this canvas using the distress crayons and smudging them with my finger. Before I do that though, I'm going to go ahead and take a sentiment here. This is from a My Favorite Things stamp set. I'll have that link down below as well. And I just cut apart the sentiment because I wanted it to be stacked, and this was one full line. So I'm just cut it apart and I'm mounting it onto my clear block. Then I'll go ahead and prep the area of the canvas that I want to stamp, and I'm going to use my EK Success Powder tool to do that. You could use a dryer sheet or you could use an embossing buddy. There's a couple of other different anti-static tools that you can use to go ahead and cut down on any static cling that might be on your paper. I'm going to stamp down that sentiment using some Simon Says Stamp clear ink, and then I'll go ahead and heat set that with some white embossing powder from Ranger. And one thing I love about the distress crayons is once they're dry, unlike the inks, the embossing powder doesn't stick to the crayon very easily because it dries pretty quickly and it's not wet after it's been dried. Now here I'm taking a stencil from Holtz. This is the bubble layering stencil, and I'm taking that crayon and I'm smudging this into the stencil and blending it out with my finger. I'm just smudging my finger across the color and really allowing that distress crayon to blend into the canvas and blend across it to create a little bit of a fun pattern. Another thing I want to show you is that I love being able to heat the distress crayons with my heat gun. So here I'm taking my heat gun and I'm applying heat to the bubbles that we applied down with the Distress Crayon, and it's puffing up the edges of the Distress Crayon and giving it a more raised and dimensional look. I really love how this adds so much texture. You can see here the dimension that you get from heating those up. And it's just subtle, but it's enough to really add a little bit of interest to this card, and I really love how this turns out. Now I also wanted to go ahead and finish up the canvas by adding some red Distress Crayon along the edges. That's just going to help finish this off and make sure that there's no white areas showing. This is a great trick to make sure you hide those edges so that way they don't stand out, because otherwise it looks a little unfinished when you have the white areas peeking out from the edge of the canvas. If you're looking for a more distressed look, you might want to go ahead and do some sanding to the edges of the canvas to give it a more weathered look, but I want it to be nice and smooth here, so I'm just going to go ahead and blend that out. Now we need to go ahead and finish the card that has our dog on it. So here I'm going to take some Peacock Feathers Distress ink. I'm going to start blending in some sky. I want him to have a little bit of a grassy scene around him with a little bit of a blue sky in the background. So I'm taking the peacock feathers and I'm applying that down onto the paper, just doing some simple blending to go ahead and create a little bit of a sky behind him. I'm going to take my distress sprayer now and I'm going to apply some splatters of water across the background. Now, another thing I'll mention is that the Distress Crayons do not react with the water because, again, we've already reacted them with the water originally. So now that they've been reacted with water as we watercolored with them, they're not reacting with the water that we're splattering onto the background. So here the ink on the background is reacting, but the crayon on the dog is not. So this is a really great way to be able to keep adding layers to your card without having to worry about messing things up. Now here I'm adding in the foreground for the dog. I'm just creating a little bit of a grassy area in front of him. And this is what's going to hide my little smudge of ink that I had gotten onto my paper when I stamped him down. So this really worked out in hiding that little goof. So definitely don't despair when you have something like that happen with your stamping. Most of the time you can always fix what you've messed up. There's usually never not a way to be able to fix something. I'm going to blend out the little foreground area that I'm creating here with my water brush. I'm allowing the greens and the browns to mix a little bit, but I don't want them to mix too much because I still want the definition between the two. I'm also going to add a little bit of contrast to the grass using a darker green crayon. I'm just going to go ahead and flick some grass blades down just like I did for the first coat, and I'm going to blend them out with my water brush, and that's just going to help give this grass a little bit more interest and contrast to help it have a little bit more of a realistic appearance. Going to add a little bit more shading to the bottom portion of the foreground. And again, these Distress Crayons do not react after you've applied them down and reacted them with water. So I'm able to come back in with all these extra layers, and I'm not messing up the layers that I had underneath because they've already been reacted with the water. I'm going to go ahead and take my EK Success powder tool once again. This time I'm prepping the surface of the card, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment and heat emboss it with some white embossing powder. Now this sentiment is also from the My Favorite Things stamp set that I used for the sentiment on the canvas. I'm just going to ink that up with some Simon Says Stamp clear ink once again, and I'll stamp that down right there onto the left side of the card. I'll go ahead and heat set that with some white embossing powder, and now I'm taking some red Simon Says Stamp ink and a couple of hearts, which are from a stamp set also from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm just going to stamp these randomly above the dog and around the dog, just to give a little interest to the background and finish off the card nicely. I think the pop of red really draws out the color in his face and his tongue and really matches up well with the card design. Now finally, I'm going to go ahead and mount this onto a A2 sized card. This is made from some Kona Coffee cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. I'll go ahead and score that at 5.5 inches to make an A2 4¼ by 5.5 inch card. I'll score that down and also crease it with my bone folder just to make sure I have a nice crease. And then I'll end up popping this card panel onto the card base just like that. And that'll go ahead and give a nice framing to the artwork that we've created using the Tim Holtz Crazy Dog stamp set and Distress Crayons. So here's a look at the two projects we created today, the card on the left and the little mini canvas on the right. These are just a couple of ways that you can go ahead and use the Distress Crayons to do some really fun watercoloring techniques. There are so many different ways that you can use the Distress Crayons, and I hope today's video has given you a couple ideas on how to do so. Here's a close-up look at not only the texture of the canvas. I love how that Distress Crayon and heating it up with my heat gun allowed me to get some really fun texture and dimension to the background. And also here's a look at the watercoloring on the dog and the texture that we got by having the first layer of color stain the dog and give him a little bit more of a furry look. So if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and be sure to leave any questions that you have in the comment section below. You can find us on social media at Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, YouTube, as well as our blog. And thanks so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.